This episode is brought to you by Studiosity. What does it mean to be an educated person? In 2026, degree value is at risk. Not from AI generally, but from student dependency. This reliance has eroded trust, trapping the sector in a culture of suspicion. Studiosity has flipped this to help colleges defend the enormous value behind degrees by replacing that suspicion with student agency. Through formative feedback process and self-validation, students can always show the personal effort behind their work, while educators set their own standards to teach, not police. Colleges are moving past dependency and suspicion to defensible evidence of learning. To find out how, visit studiosity.com. There's so many ways in which AI tools are posing challenges to our social systems these days, and one of those areas is to democracy. A recent policy brief by a Harvard University Center for Ethics that was titled Guarding Democracy in the Age of AI noted that generative AI systems have the potential to interfere with key parts of our democratic process through what it called widespread deception, surveillance, and manipulation of information. In plain language, we're talking AI deepfakes that can spread misinformation and propaganda in ways people can't even tell is faked, as well as new ways for governments to track and monitor citizens. All of this poses challenges to our whole system of self-government. Colleges in the U.S. have long played a key role in supporting democracy. The mission statements of many colleges around the country include fostering informed citizens as a key reason for being. So in that role, as part of our democracy, how should colleges adjust to this AI moment? That question was on my mind when I flew to Washington, D.C. last month to sit down with the director of a new center at Georgetown University that's exploring AI and democracy. The effort is called the Initiative on Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Citizenship, AIDC, and it's led by Mark Fisher, an assistant professor of government at Georgetown. His expertise is in the history of ancient political thought, so he puts AI in a context of a very long history of democracy.
So not just seeing this as an unprecedented technological problem, that democracy may or may not survive, but within this larger history of democracy, an iteration of really difficult problems that have tested the resilience of this idea, really forced the idea to change.
Of course, America's founding fathers, they had lots of ideas about the importance of education for democracy, with Thomas Jefferson famously stressing how key an educated public is to making self-government work. But democracy dates back to ancient Greece, and their version of democracy, it didn't really look exactly like what we have going in America today.
What I'm always so impressed by in studying the history of democracy is how underdetermined it is. That is, we have meant so many different things by democracy over its history that, it is a constantly moving target or evolving idea.
It's a pivotal time for democracy, partly because of the rise of AI. And Mark's Center at Georgetown is just one of the many ways that scholars are trying to intervene and explore how to better teach democratic citizens in the AI era. What can educators do to safeguard democracy in this dynamic time? Welcome to Learning Curve, where we look at how education is adapting to the rise of generative AI. I'm Jeff Young. I met up with Mark Fisher at Georgetown's downtown campus, which is just a short walk from the Capitol. We met there because Fisher's project was organizing a big public talk later that night in an auditorium there, and he needed to be there to help with the setup. Fisher says the goal in these discussions is to bring together a mix of different kinds of experts who don't always talk to each other, like scholars of ancient democracy and those looking at more current policy issues, as well as experts on ethics and maybe others that look at how governments work. That's because democracy is, after all, a massively interdisciplinary concern, involving so many aspects of society. So I was curious to start my conversation with Mark by getting a better sense of what issues that he and his center are most interested in tackling.
So I think what worries me or concerns me most is maybe not what is top of mind for a lot of other people. So I think people immediately go to like deep fakes, right?
Yeah.
Not a trivial problem, but also I think something that given time we can figure out. Once again, as a historian of ancient Greek democracy, they didn't have tape recorders or video recorders either. They communicated entirely through language, which is a notoriously tricky or unreliable source of information, we'll say, right?
Yeah.
So this idea, it's like, oh, we're going to have to do democracy through a medium that may lie to us. You're like, well, yeah, that's what doing democracy has mostly been throughout human history. The idea that we have these epistemic backstops, as they say, these ways of sort of determining absolute truthless, that's very new. That's a very new idea. And so we've internalized that as a necessity for democracy. I think, as you say, the speed in which certain norms are being eroded is the bigger problem there, right? So we have come to build a public culture that relies on those forms of truth. Moving too quickly away from that is really disorienting. So it is a problem. I don't mean to
So deepfakes are a thing.
Deepfakes are a thing. But I tell my students this and they're not impressed by it, but I could have deepfakes. I think there's actually some promise to deepfakes in that, it's a long time now that we really should not be relying on what we see on social media, right? And in some ways, deepfakes force the issue. Like it's gotten to the point now where, last time I talked to my dad, he was saying, I just can't believe what I see on Instagram anymore. And I was like, that's great. I'm glad. Like you shouldn't have believed what you saw on Instagram 3 years ago either, right? But now it's kind of raised to the level of public awareness that they really shouldn't be just absorbing this information, that they need to be much more critical consumers of online content. So it does pose all sorts of problems, inconveniences. We're going to need to come up with new norms for thinking about this. The greater problem, though, that concerns me is passivity, right? Which is, and I think that this is the reason why I think this is really dangerous is because I think one way in which people are going to respond to AI is to think about ways that it can automate the democratic process so that people don't actually need to do it. And it's going to produce outcomes that are maybe aligned with what we think of as our preferences. And they're going to want to call that democracy, right? So it's really a sort of strictly utilitarian, right? We're producing the correct outputs and we don't have to put anything into it. But as long as the outputs are for the good of the people, however is defined by the machine or the people who are kind of building it, we're okay with that. That's democracy.
Is it kind of an autopilot system you fear there?
Yeah, or I would say, something that is really only concerned with output as opposed to participation or the process whereby individuals govern themselves. And so I think like that is the real danger. And so this is the danger with agents, with offloading governance to AI systems, with offloading. I mean, there's tons of problems with this. There's problems of accountability. There's problems with, but I genuinely think that we are going to be very dissatisfied with democracy as a system of government, even if it's producing what on paper looks like really excellent.
Even if our roads are built and the fire department
we don't have
what it needs to be.
If we don't have a sense that we have actually done something to achieve that result, I genuinely think people are built in such a way that we take responsibility and get satisfaction from things when we have been part of the messy process to get there, right? It's part of achievement. It's part of doing difficult things. And as much as we are driven to try to reduce friction in our life and, achieve good outcomes with minimal effort, it starts to feel pretty hollow, right? And it's actually about that process of doing difficult things that really gives us the sense of achievement. This is also true in governance and self-governance especially. And so if you think about democracy not just as achieving a certain objective set of results, but rather as producing a community of people who feel responsible for their community, who feel empowered in a way where they think that what they do matters for how they're going to be governed and what the community is like, that's not going to be compatible with folks just turning governance on autopilot. And so I'm a little concerned because I do think there's just kind of a realist psychological take was if we do hand things over to that, people are going to be dissatisfied with that system, become deeply resentful of it and break it. And
Because
so,
that's what happens in lo-fi democracy if people don't feel like they've been heard. Is that what you mean?
lo-fi democracy or non-democracies, right? I mean, I think, there we blur the line between what is a democracy and is non-democracy. Now, there's an important part of accountability in here in terms of defining what exactly is a democracy. But I really do push on this idea that a democracy is a community in which people feel responsible for the outcomes of the community and they feel empowered, like what they do matters, right? And so if you feel genuinely that what you do doesn't matter, you're not really going to take any active interest in the good of the community. You're not going to think that what you're doing is consequential. You're not going to be a meaningful member of that democratic community. And, maybe I lean a little too heavily on older ways of thinking about democracy. But that was really at the center of their definition. So if you look at the first ever attempt to kind of theorize what democracy was.
And you're talking about way back.
Herodotus, right? Herodotus is arguing about sort of what the outcome of switching from a tyranny to a democracy was in Athens. For him, it was primarily about military results. He said, hey, all of a sudden, they overthrew the tyranny and they just performed so much better. All of a sudden, they became the strongest military power in the region. And his argument there was, well, when you're working for someone else or when you don't feel like any of the good things that come from successful policy come to you, you're going to slack, right? You don't really work very hard because you don't see any relationship between your effort and outcomes. And so what happens in Athens and what he takes to the real crux of democracy is everyone gets to all of a sudden feel like they're working for themselves in working for the community. And they see that if I perform in a certain way, if I do something, I'm going to actually change my circumstances as a result.
So the payoff is both communal and selfish.
Yeah. So it's a strong identification with the community, right? So it's not purely altruistic. We don't have to sacrifice your own good for the good of the community.
Just for the others.
No, it's you see that there's a clear correlation between what you do and what happens in terms of politics, governance, the communal welfare, right? And so you matter in that case. And I think that really is at the center of democracy. And, by that standard, modern democracy, the kind of representative electoral democracy that we live in now, has really strained that. But as we've seen, people are not real happy about that, right? To the extent that people have become sufficiently disenchanted with current democratic systems, mostly it's because they just feel like whatever they do doesn't matter. The choices that they're given don't really matter. Whether they vote or not doesn't really matter. And they haven't, as a result, just said, oh, well, this is great, I'm going to go along. They have taken more and more extreme steps to do things that matter. They want to do something where they can actually see that because I joined this movement, because I voted for this politician, things are different now.
Even if it's
even if it's really violent, disruption of the status quo. The desire to have agency is, I think, fundamental to us in a way that this is why I say, even if we have a democracy that's producing objectively good outcomes, people are eventually going to break it just because they want to see if they can, right? And that's a sort of fundamental desire we have to see the world react to us. Like, I don't know if you ever watch like little kids interact with the world. They'll knock things over and chase after birds. And I think it's just because they want to see the world respond to them, right? And I don't know that we totally ever lose that. But to the extent that democratic forms of rule lose that, I think they're in trouble, right? And that a stable, meaningful form of democracy needs to actually not just be responsible or responsive to people in the aggregate, but actually be responsive to people at the individual level, such that democratic citizens do feel like what they're doing has some tangible result. Now, of course, in a community of 330 million, you can't dictate national policy, but some of this is like we have maybe centralized too much, and a return to meaningful forms of civic participation that are more local is necessary so people can see that they have some say in things.
Right. When they did something happened.
Right. Maybe that's school boards or that's, running for local politics or local councils or whatever it is. Having, the problem is like those spaces have themselves become absorbed into national politics in a way. there's interesting political science research that we used to say that all politics was local, and it's actually really kind of reversed now, right? It's that even local politics are now national, right? You go to the school board meeting, and what are you fighting about? Democratic and Republican talking points, right? And I think trying to kind of rectify that balance in a way and sort of return some sense of genuine agency to people at a more local level is an important part of this. I think the realities of the world we live in means we can't just have local decentralized governance. There's going to have to be these larger state systems. But these are the sorts of things that I would love to see us thinking about, and especially when thinking about AI, sort of how do we use AI to help restore that balance rather than further entrench this sense of powerlessness and the loss of agency. And this is what I see as the real issue with how things are going right now and why there's such poor numbers in terms of popularity of AI. And it's because people feel like this is something being done to them that they don't want, right? And they have been basically told, this is going to totally overturn your life as you know it. Sorry, but you've got.
Why don't you help make it?
Yeah. But like, hey, you buy a $20 subscription per month, and like you can do cool things with it, and like vibe code or whatever. Like, and I don't want to say I'm not totally dismissive of this technology. I think this technology is incredible, and I think there are very positive use cases. But I think the problem right now with it is not the technology so much as the kind of larger socioeconomic system in which it's being unfolded, pursued, and the just general sense that like people are being almost held hostage right now. Maybe that's too strong, but like they're not being given any sense of agency in this, and that's crazy. I mean, the idea that something so wildly popular that is man-made and man-driven, right, and yet they're being told that they can't do anything about it. That is a real problem for something like democratic governance, right? How can you say that we live in a democracy when most people, overwhelmingly want to pause or take a step, and they're just being told no, right?
Yeah.
Why? Well, because about 20 people, right, think that this is really what has to happen, either because they stand to make a ton of money on it. I actually don't think that that's the biggest reason. I think it has more to do with they want to be world historical figures. I think they do think that this is inevitable, and they want to be the person who's done it. There are weird instances of sort of like, I would say like elite rivalry among them in terms of the competition to be the person the first. They fear each other. They don't trust each other. There's all sorts of weird dynamics there. And then, of course, on the national level, we're told, well, we have to do this because if China does it,
if it's not us,
it's going to be China, and they're going to rule over. You're going to be just a slave to China, and so sorry, there's no choice, right?
Yeah,
and that's not democracy. I don't totally believe the geopolitical argument. Right. I think that is called upon to shut down conversations and shut down arguments. It's a rhetorical device. I do think a lot of people genuinely believe that. I think that we, given how important a role that is playing in our national conversation and national policy, that's something we should really be scrutinizing. People really need to be seriously thinking, one, is China even trying to do this thing that we claim that they're trying to do? I'm not sure that they are. And two, if they succeed at it, are they really going to try to use that to invade us and take control? I don't think so, Yeah. Now, I would love to have someone who's a policy expert or a security expert tell me that I'm completely wrong about this. But I think that those are the conversations we really need to be having rather than sort of just using that as a way to shut down conversations. Like, if that is going to be the reason why we can't slow down the progress of a technology that is going to radically undermine democracy, our social lives, our work, right? Let's really think about whether that's a good argument or not. And right now, we're just not being given the space to do that.
It's so interesting because, we've quickly gone from all kinds of things to capitalism and corporations and global politics. But back to democracy for a second. I want to just make sure I understand something you mentioned. You're not so worried about deepfakes, this passivity you mentioned. Mm-hmm. What does that look like just to make sure I understand, like, what is that? Why is AI... Aren't we really going to send agents to the local school board meeting for us? Like, what is the passive democratic participation you worry about with AI?
Yeah. So, I think it's part of larger trend, right? I mean, no, I think to the extent that we're still having school board meetings and we're believing in the democratic process, we're probably, hopefully not going to be sending our agents.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is danger of a sort of systemic approach of cognitive offloading, de-skilling, but also further social isolation that occurs as a result of this. Like, we are further encouraged to interact with our chatbots or with our personal AI companions, and they are going to take the necessary data from us, feed that somewhere else. Decisions are going to be made that are optimal, right? They've saved us time. They've saved us friction. We don't need to go get into a shouting match at the local school board anymore.
Or read the voter guide.
Right? And so we've made things easier for us.
Here, Mark got a little distracted when he noticed that something was going on in the background, an issue setting up a podium for the evening's event on AI and democracy.
No, smart.
Okay. So
yeah, I mean, I think there's two different things. I mean, one is a very specific, like the extent to which we actually embrace these systems as governance tools, right, is going to mean greater and greater passivity, right? We are going to be observed. Observed sounds very Orwellian. I don't, it may go that route, but I'm not trying to be like super paranoid about this, but like, we are going to be the producers of data, right? That data then is going to be collected, analyzed, and optimal outcomes are going to be produced without us having to actually put in any conscious effort into that, right? And so that itself is just making us more passive in the process of governance, right? And then I think that there's a sort of more general problem, which is as we sort of slip deeper and deeper into a world in which this is all around us, and it's not just governance, it's consumer habits, it's education, it's our social behaviors, we are going to find it harder and harder to actually do the hard thing of going to a meeting, arguing with our neighbor about difficult topics, right? To the extent that we have actually really normalized like the sycophantic behavior of chatbots, which can serve a lot of great purposes. I'm not trying to be totally anti this, right? We may end up having, in some ways, a better understanding of the world as a result of this, and one that's more pleasant, right? But to the extent that we have normalized this as like how we get information and how we interact with things, we're going to find it really hard to then go have difficult conversations with people about politics, right?
I see.
So it's kind of like, my generation, when we got cell phones and all of a sudden you didn't have to answer people's phone calls anymore, right? All of a sudden we found it really hard to call people, right? Like to actually just cold call someone and say, hey, I need this, to the point where like I have friends who just won't do it, will not do it. And that seems really trivial, but I think it's the sort of way it's like, these are actually these social skills that we often take for granted and are absolutely essential for building community, maintaining community, will atrophy really, really quickly, right? And, the more passive we become, again, passive just means like we stay in our safe shell and mediate our interactions into the world through these various forms of digital technology and AI, the harder we're going to find it to do the really difficult business of living in a community with people. And living in a community is hard, right? I think it's well worth it. It's one of the greatest things we do. It's like being in a long-term relationship, Yeah. Everyone says when you get married, like, it's hard, right? You're like, oh no, and it is, but it is also well worth it.
Right. It's not saying you shouldn't do it.
No. But it means like, being an individual, staying an individual, and having a really deep, meaningful relationship with another individual has, points of friction in it. And that's good that you grow from that. The same is true of any community that you're involved in.
Just to step back for a second here. This reminds me of the concern that so many professors and other educators have about students cheating on their homework with ChatGPT and other tools because they give students an easy button that takes away the friction that can lead to real learning. Mark is essentially saying that the same idea applies to democratic participation as well. In other words, if students get too used to hitting the easy button while they're learning, it might bleed into other aspects of their lives. So that the idea of engaging in debate with other humans, which can be messy and awkward and challenging, will be something that people avoid as well. And that's a key part of the democratic process.
was talking with students the other day who were sort of skeptical of this. And I said, like, the more and more you get convinced of this idea that the entire world should be responsive to your desires and needs, the less you're going to ever be able to actually be an effective community member. Why? Because a lot of being part of a community is doing things that you find boring and you're not that interested in, listening to people talk about their day despite the fact that, like, you don't really care, right?
The school board meeting's not a bad example.
Yeah.
They can be boring.
Right.
But they might have a result that you care about.
Absolutely. And in order to actually be effective, you need to listen to those people. You need to actually understand what they're trying to say. You need to cultivate the skill of empathy, right? And that is not something that AI is going to help us cultivate, or at least not currently. Maybe we can build specific LLMs that are about creating empathy. But so I do think that there are also these larger sort of worries about the type of people that we're going to become when we live in an AI-saturated society. And so, like, on the one hand, you do have the governance issues. On the other hand, you just have the, like, what is it going to be like to be a person? And is that going to be someone who is actually capable of undertaking the really difficult bits of communal governance? And if we're not ready to do that, we're not ready to step in, what sorts of abuses does that open us up to, right? And, this gets back to the other component of democracy, which is accountability, and specifically elite accountability, right? So if democracy is about taking collective ownership, right, seeing your agency enacted, it's also about being able to check the power of those who are really ambitious and trying to kind of steer the community towards their own interests. And the more apathetic we are, the more that we're just satisfied in our own bubbles, the less we're going to actually stick our neck out and say, no, you shouldn't be able to get away with that. Actually, that's not right. In fact, we're going to band together and not let you do that. And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing people not be willing to put in the effort to hold people accountable just because it's going to disrupt their own private interest, economic advantage, etc.
Are you thinking of, like, corporations that are pushing back on certain, like, what are you thinking of when you say that?
Well, maybe I won't. I can tell you what I'm thinking of, but I don't necessarily know that that's what I want to have you record.
Okay.
So I think, you could talk about electoral politics, right?
Okay.
I think politicians are able to get away with things now that would have been tremendously disqualifying a long time before. Partly this is personality, partly this is the change of, but what's interesting is in those moments, in those instances, what seems to be the argument is, well, really what I care about is the price of eggs or the price of oil. What I care about is my family's economic prospects, right? What I care about, are we going to vote for a policy that is maybe quite brutal to a lot of people that we don't think of as part of our community, right? And are we willing to kind of other certain groups and just turn our backs to them if it's going to help me buy more eggs? I don't think that's
a comfort.
Yeah,
something easy or convenient.
Exactly, right? That has come to dominate our politics. A very sharp line of like not stepping back from certain principles of other regardedness, of things that we think are just morally sort of red lines, right? Or bright lines that you can't cross, right? We have begun to give up on those, and I think give up on a role of, especially in the U.S., of this idea that, like, we're trying to hold ourselves to a certain standard that we think is valuable not just for us but for others as well, because things have gotten expensive, right? Or because I've read these things online that make me uncomfortable, or and so I do think our politics are headed in a very, I would say, self-interested direction, but self-interested in a very narrow conception of self-interest. And we're told you should be able to, and you should vote on what, your own private conception of what you like and dislike is about, not a sort of larger conception of what you think is the public good.
So that is the big picture of these social forces being shaped by AI. What can colleges do to shore up democracy in this AI era? We'll get to that right after the break. This episode is brought to you by Studiosity. As AI reshapes higher education, every leader needs to be asking right now, is this AI tool, or any tool, building capacity or just dependence in our students? Georgia State University recently put that to the test. Their impact study showed that when students used Studiosity, DFW rates dropped from nearly 39% to just 8%. And this isn't just about better grades. It's about valuing the thinking and writing process as much as the validation of learning. Studiosity rejects the culture of surveillance that has turned educators into police. For a model that focuses on formative process, student agency, and teacher choice. Move beyond the detection age, back to defensible evidence of learning. Visit Studiosity.com. That's Studiosity.com. Now back to the episode. So what can schools and colleges, what can education do in the face of these, clearly social forces and very big forces?
Yeah, I think this is really tricky, and this is where I don't feel like I have as clearly a clear answer, but it's this space that I think we really need to be working in, and that's been hard because, like in so many other spaces, we've tended to polarize on this issue, right? You get folks who are just all in on AI. Let's see what it can do, right? Let it grade my exams, let it write my exams, let's use it as tutors. And then you have, the never AIers or whatever we want to call them, who want to go back to blue books, who insist that this is just not what college is for, not just higher education, but and both have very good arguments here. Both, I think, are pointing to something very real. On the one hand, if we do begin the process of cognitive offloading from day one, students are not going to develop the capacities to read, write, think for themselves in the way that education is supposed to be about, right?
And the way the founders conceived of citizens in our
Absolutely. Liberal arts, right, really goes back to this idea of you're creating a liberal subject, which in the Latin is a free subject, right? We were creating free people, which means people capable of governing themselves. And so the point of liberal arts studies is to actually make people capable of guiding their own lives, creating a meaningful life for themselves, making hard decisions for themselves. And that was a significant part of being a member of a free community. And so we can't give up on that, right? We still need to be creating critical, cognitively capable people, right? Who can hold two thoughts in their head at once, who can read long, difficult books,
argue with their
neighbor constructively, right? Whose attention span lasts longer than 5-10 seconds, but also who don't engage in the world in the way that TikTok does. If you think about TikTok, you never need to pay attention to something that doesn't immediately catch your interest.
Just pass.
Yeah, it teaches us that, it never teaches us how to be productively bored, right? And in fact, you can go through and never have to be bored.
I didn't know democracy was boredom is so important to.
I think boredom is really important in our life in general. Again, not productively bored, sure. Empathetically bored, right? Or sort of engaged in things beyond yourself, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully eventually you don't take that to be boring, right?
Yeah,
you learn that that's interesting. The other way to talk about this would be to say we cultivate curiosity, right?
Yeah.
That we're actually curious about things that don't immediately catch our interest.
This point about curiosity, it makes me think about our recent episode about AI and design. When the official I talked to from SCAD, the Savannah College of Art and Design, emphasized that one of the durable skills that students need more than ever is curiosity. But here, Mark is framing a lack of curiosity as a problem for our communities as well, and therefore to our political system. And what I hear him saying is that making sure students don't just cheat on every assignment by having AI do it because it all just seems boring and unimportant to them is not just a problem for academic integrity and this idea that we need to prove what students know. The AI cheating issue is also about whether students are prepared to engage in their communities in deep and authentic ways once they leave campus.
Okay, so we definitely need to keep that, right? Like, we absolutely need to keep that. I also think, though, we need to be realistic about the world that we're living in, right? And we need to be training students who are part of the digital world, who are able of thinking critically about the digital world, but also capable of using the tools that it gives to them to be effective agents. And that's the thing about this technology is, if used correctly, it really does just tremendously improve our capacity, right? Anyone who sat down with Claude Cowork for a weekend knows that, like, they can do things that they never thought that they were able to do before.
Right.
And that's potentially a real source of good in the world. So if you create really cognitively capable people who also have a sense of what technology can and cannot do for them, that to me is what we want to be aiming for. And so I take it that the point of education is to create capable people. And creating capable people means carving out space where they don't use technology to offload, right? They actually have to do the hard thing themselves. It also means creating people who can effectively use technology. And so we don't yet have, I think, a clear vision of how to strike that middle approach. And that, I think, is really where we need to be working. It's uncomfortable, doesn't allow us to polarize in the way that we increasingly want to do, right? We need to some sides say, I'm not sure, but it's somewhere in between, right?
A little bit of this, a little bit of that.
And it's also going to require that we put in the work of rejigging our syllabi once again. And I think it's a hard sell right now for a lot of, extremely overwhelmed, overburdened, exhausted teachers, right? Who, especially coming out of the pandemic, had to completely change the way that they taught in their syllabus. And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 years later, they thought they were going to need to go back to normal. Now you're saying, no, we need to completely rethink education. And I think a lot of folks are exhausted, justifiably exhausted.
So to Mark, teaching students to be good citizens should involve a mix of making sure they have some time learning away from AI tools, so they develop old-fashioned critical thinking skills, and also the time to learn how to effectively use AI. But what about other things that scholars and researchers can do outside of the classroom? Like this public event that Mark was working on that day that I talked to him. What role does he see colleges playing in shoring up democracy in an AI age?
What I'd say is that AIDC is really trying to do, which is bring together people who otherwise wouldn't talk to each other, but have really important things to say about a common subject. And so I don't think this is a problem just in terms of AI. I think this is a problem in general, which is we have started creating organizations and associating with each other in ways that are much more aligned with what we share rather than the ways in which we can productively disagree. And so I think this ties into a lot of the themes that I've been talking about here, which is really leaning into productive friction and finding ways to push ourselves a little bit outside of our comfort zone and take that to be the point, not just, that is what we are aiming for, as opposed to just an unfortunate aspect of the process. And so what AIDC really is trying to do in bringing, humanist scholars into a room with policymakers, those are two people who really probably don't want to be in the room together and wouldn't naturally do that. And
they're not hanging out at a dinner party.
No, not really. And that's exactly why we're bringing them into a room together. And so what I would love to see, well, I should say, and I think for very understandable reasons, a lot of the organizations that have popped up, on AI issues are really like-minded groups of people who have a very specific vision of what they should be doing. They have a very specific policy they want to be promoting. And so it's taken a very different approach. It's, harnessing collective power to pursue a unified agenda, as opposed to organizing in ways that are intentionally in tension with themselves, and thinking that the creation of those spaces, which are not aimed at producing a very specific result, but rather getting people to change their mind, to see things differently, and to approach these questions with more perspective. I would like to see other folks try to do that. I understand why they don't. It's very hard, right? And, it's a tough sell. But I think to the extent that we're going to be able to find our way through all of this, that's where we need to start. And I think democracy is a really great banner under which this can happen, because we're saying, like, look, to be pro-democracy, you actually need to practice democracy, and you need to do the hard parts of democracy. And if you're pro-democracy, but you're not willing to engage with folks who disagree with you, you're not. It's questionable to the extent to which, like, actually, you want to do the hard part of democracy. And so I think in classrooms as well as organizations, I say with my students, like, you can't just theoretically learn about democracy. You need to do democracy. Like, part of an education about democracy should be going out and doing hard things and meeting people and networking and stuff that sort of typically falls outside of the curriculum. But if you're going to be an effective actor, you need to learn how to cold call someone. You need to learn how to go set up a networking lunch with someone. And I think traditional people of my background, the classicists, the idea that that is a meaningful way of studying democracy as opposed to going back and translating Thucydides, is really foreign, right? But I think we want to have both of those. We want to give them the historical perspective, and then we want to create really effective actors who aren't intimidated by trying to actually create a coalition of people, right? So that those two people aren't partitioned from one another. That we have effective democratic actors who also have this deep understanding of the democratic tradition and a sense of context that they can bring to what they're trying to do.
I wanted to circle back to this topic of AI and misinformation, which we did a whole episode on here on Learning Curve a couple months ago during the ice surge in Minnesota. If you missed that, you should go back and find it on the feed. I talked to some student journalists and a journalism professor at the University of Minnesota about how AI is playing a role in spreading AI deepfakes and cartoonish propaganda. It seems this raises important policy questions that a center like Mark's might be really interested in. So what does he think about AI deepfakes as a problem for democracy?
I mean to say that it's not, and once again, I think it has to do with the speed at which this is coming out, which is,
right.
We're seeing the collapse of certain norms of kind of how do we determine what is fact and what is fiction,
right?
And we don't have the time to recreate new norms, right, that help us, whether that's watermarking or turning back to a more face-to-face form of social interaction.
Like, there is a solution to that.
There are solutions, but like with so much around AI, like there are answers to these problems. What's harder is the political logic. Like, how do you actually take that answer and ingrain it within our society such that it becomes the norm?
If this were a sci-fi, it feels so much like we're living in a sci-fi novel. It's like in the three-body problem, like the aliens are coming and it's like 100 years out, so we have time. And then what do we do as we? What is the world? And they, there are the governments come together to build spaceships to attack. It's like, sure. What are we? But AI doesn't seem to be, or like maybe it isn't quite, or maybe it will, join countries across lines to like solve some new problem.
Maybe it's really, I mean, one of the real difficulties is that the tools that we need to solve this are themselves already part of the problem, right? Mm-hmm. So the question of how would you actually begin to build a coalition throughout the country, internationally, right. Well, you need to actually use AI-based tools in ways that are increasingly, already really, really tricky. And so I think that's one of the hardest parts about this problem and why the political logic is so often intractable, even if the policy answer is fairly clear. It's that, in order to counter some of the really nasty effects of AI, we need to go through the tools that are already kind of saturated with those nasty effects. And that's really hard to do. And I think that's what we don't yet know. I think that's what's really hampering our ability to act effectively on all this.
With all these challenges, I was curious to hear what he sees as the prospects for our democracy. Does he think American democracy can survive the arrival of generative AI?
I think democracy will change. And I think something that we call democracy will definitely come out on the other end. But I think we need to be really careful and observant about what that is and whether it actually deserves the name or whether it's, whether we can justify it as democracy, right? And we want to be really critical about that and not just sort of accept whatever they give to us as democracy, right? I mean, all sorts of authoritarian institutions have called themselves democracy in the past.
Elections.
Yeah. So we just, I think, need to be really aware and active in terms of defining for ourselves what we're willing to call democracy and what we want from democracy.
So there's a call to action of this center.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly a call to action. I don't know that we have delusions of grandeur in terms of our ability to spread that call to action.
You're not the hero of the science fiction novel.
No, I mean, we're really lucky that our local community is a community that has maybe a disproportionate amount of influence over national politics.
Right.
And so
You are right here at the Capitol.
Yeah, we are here in the Capitol. And so we're trying to do a local thing that has national implications, but not because we think that everyone's going to start to listen to us, but rather that, there are folks here that we're trying to change their mind in certain small ways that we hope really has kind of positive ripple effects further down the line.
Thank you so much for doing this, and good luck with the event, and we'll be watching what you do. Thanks
Awesome.
so much.
Really appreciate it.
This has been Learning Curve, where we tackle big questions at the intersection of AI and education. I would love to hear your thoughts. Are you trying something in your class that aims to make your students better citizens in the AI era? Do you know of other efforts by colleges to safeguard democracy? Shoot me a note at jeff@learningcurve.fm. I love to hear from listeners. If you don't already, please follow the show and share it with a friend or on social media to help spread the word. This episode was written and produced by me, Jeff Young. You can find more of my work at jeffyoung.net. Our theme music is by Kamaku, and the episode art was generated with the AI image generator, Midjourney. Also, thanks to our sponsor for the episode, Studiosity. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more of Learning Curve. Until then, thanks for listening.